Good afternoon. My name is Steve Hernandez, and I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut State Legislature's Nonpartisan Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity, and Opportunity. We are here today to conduct the next of our Reimagining Democracy series. Today's focus will be on Towards Perfecting the Union. First of all, I would like to note that one of our panelists, the Honorable Themis Clarides, who is the Minority Leader of the Connecticut General Assembly, the House, is unable to join us today. Sadly, the Clarides and the Clarides Ditra family lost their dear father over the weekend. She does send her thoughts, and we send her our thoughts as they go through this difficult time. To the Clarides family and to the Clarides Ditra family, we're thinking about you. Welcome, everyone. We're here today to have a conversation about our democracy. We are joined today by thinkers from all over the country and even some of our friends from here in the state. But first of all, I'd like to introduce our keynote of sorts for today, keynote in the world of Zoom, and that is John Bridgeland. Bridgeland is the founder and CEO of Civic, a social enterprise firm in Washington, D.C. He is also co-founder and CEO of the COVID Collaborative, a national platform that marshals top leaders and institutions in health, education, and the economy to work with state and local leaders to combat COVID. He also co-founded Act Now, a ground-up effort to re-envision policing and public safety across 14 communities representing the diversity of the United States. He also serves as vice chairman of Unite, a national platform that brings leaders across sectors and political parties together to tackle public challenges. In 2018, Bridgeland served as co-chair of policy and a commissioner of the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development at the Aspen Institute. In 2010, President Obama appointed Bridgeland to the White House Council for Community Solutions, where he authored the report Opportunity Road, the promise and challenge of America's forgotten youth. Bridgeland previously served as director of the White House Domestic Policy Council in the first term of President George W. Bush, where he coordinated policy on more than 100 issues, and then as assistant to the President of the United States, the first director of the USA Freedom Corps, where he coordinated policy on international, national, community, and faith-based service in the aftermath of 9/11. Bridgeland also co-authored the book Teaching America, The Case for Civic Education, led the White House Summit on American History, Civics, and Service, and worked with the National Archives to develop our documents to promote understanding of 100 important documents in American history. He testified before the National Academy of Sciences on his post-9/11 efforts to increase civic engagement. Bridgeland also served on the Bipartisan Policy Center's Commission on Political Reform, which released its bipartisan blueprint in 2014. John, I could go on and on, a lifetime of achievements in half a lifetime, or maybe a quarter of a lifetime, but I do want to welcome you on behalf of the people of the state of Connecticut. And John, the floor is yours. Welcome, sir.
Stephen, thank you so much. It's so nice to be with the people of the state of Connecticut. And I too want to express my condolences to the Claudius family. I know how difficult it is to lose a loved one, a parent, people who were just so central to your life. And of course, in this difficult time in the life of the nation, when so many people are suffering from COVID-19, it's a time to remember to our loved ones and families and friends. I'm thrilled to be with you at this conference to reimagine our democracy in what is clearly a time, in my view, to rescue the heart and soul of our nation. I want to give special thanks to David Adams and you, Steve, for inviting me, the Connecticut General Assembly that's doing so much to improve our state and country, the Extraordinary Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity, and Opportunity. What a fabulous name. What a fabulous mission. And the amazing array of wonderful and distinguished panelists, including public servants you have today. You know, I think it was Joy Harjo, the Poet Laureate of the United States, and the first Native American to hold that position, who said, "When I think of the soul of the nation, I think of the process of becoming." That is where we have reached a stalemate right now. What do people in this nation want to become? We have some rough waters to navigate to answer that question. Trust in one another and in key institutions are at historic lows. Political polarization and economic inequalities are staggeringly high. We can even measure a rise in a culture of I, of narcissism, when our Constitution instead envisions a better, strong culture of we. With a once-in-a-century pandemic and continuing signs of deep systemic racism, there's a lot to be worried about, but I promise not to be so pessimistic. I could actually not be more hopeful because of the compassionate and resilient spirit of the American people themselves. And actually want to offer some concrete ideas for the way forward. I just read a survey this morning that showed that 7 out of 10 Americans agree on a whole host of issues, the public challenges the country needs to solve. So there's a powerful majority in this country who wants a better way forward than we have today. So I love the title of your conference. After 244 years of the American experiment, we should be reimagining our democracy. In fact, what does the refounding of America look like in this century to reflect all our wonderful diversity? America doesn't ask very much of us, particularly compared to the founding generation that mutually pledged to one another their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor and risked losing it all. Today we pay taxes, some of us vote, but shouldn't there be more to link rights with responsibilities? Shouldn't we do more to ensure everyone, regardless of background, has shared experiences to work together and equal access to our nation's dream? So I think actually America needs a big idea to heal its divisions. And I think that big idea is universal national service, not mandatory, but a common expectation and a common opportunity and rite of passage as young people come to age, 18 to 28-year-olds, to perform at least a year or more of national service. As General Stanley McChrystal, who leads our national service effort, has said, you don't have to wear a military uniform to serve your country. Young people right now, today, could be tutoring high-need students to prevent learning loss during the pandemic, ramp up contact tracing efforts in states like Connecticut, facilitate meals to the elderly and vulnerable. They could serve in the Peace Corps, VISTA, AmeriCorps, Conservation Corps. But the biggest benefit would be to heal a divided country. Imagine the power of bringing young people of different races, ethnicities, politics, faiths, income levels, and regions of the country together in common purpose. I actually co-chair the Earth Conservation Corps with Ethel Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy's wife. And the other day we were actually last year we were serving side by side, and we asked the young people, what are your backgrounds, your politics, your faiths? A bunch of Democrats, a bunch of independents, some Republicans, and even a libertarian. And all these people working together to solve common problems. It was so inspiring. So I could see the Connecticut General Assembly, the Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity, and Opportunity, and the Connecticut Commission on Community Service working together to create a model for the nation. In addition to receiving support through federal programs for national service, colleges and universities, nonprofits, and agencies of government throughout Connecticut could create service year opportunities at such scale that problems would be solved at lower cost to taxpayers, young people would have rites of passage to inform their careers, and things that currently divide us would be healed. This was the vision that Sergeant Shriver had when he delivered that 1961 memo to President Kennedy on the establishment of the Peace Corps, but the infrastructure didn't exist in 1961. It does today. In fact, students at Yale College recently started Ask Not chapters to ignite this vision. Let's support them all across the state. Second, we need to restore the teaching of American history and civic education to its rightful place in our schools so that children and youth understand who we are as a people, their rights and responsibilities, have a common language and points of historic reference that teach, understand the difficult stains on our history and how to heal them, and become the guardians of democracy. We clearly have work to do, and civic education is being crowded out of the curriculum. When the original Constitution was passed, it didn't include Blacks, women, Indigenous peoples, or men without property. It prompted the late Justice Thurgood Marshall to say, I do not honor the original Constitution, but I honor what that Constitution has become. Generations of leaders can't breathe new life into our elastic constitution without a strong civic education. I don't mean just how a bill becomes a law, but addressing real problems today in American democracy and having service learning and experiential learning and reflection that brings our core ideals and institutions to life. America could also, and I also want to just call out Connecticut Secretary of State Denise Merrill and Education Commissioner Diana Wenzel, who are leading the way with their Red, White, and Blue initiative on civic education. But what would it mean if the state of Connecticut would emerge with models of civic engagement and education for the rest of the country? America could also use some pretty strong political reforms to end political gerrymandering, include ranked choice voting, and more. Today, I want to highlight one powerful recommendation from the Our Common Purpose Commission to expand the House of Representatives, and perhaps that also means expanding the Connecticut General Assembly. In 1790, each representative had about 35,000 constituents to represent. Today, the average number is almost 770,000 people in a district. Expanding the House and state assemblies will make them more democratic and responsive to voters and make the Electoral College more representative. Our modern times should keep pace with our population. My final recommendation isn't a policy or program, but a change in how we view political leadership. Instead of just looking to our political representatives to solve our public challenges, political leaders might do more to tap the energy, ingenuity, and entrepreneurial spirit of the American people. My neighbor growing up when I was a teenager was Neil Armstrong. He came over for dinner because he was close to my dad. He didn't like to talk much about his landing on the moon and was actually a very quiet, reclusive, humble man. But he shared his story of one memorable night. He said when the young President Kennedy went to the well of the US House of Representatives and challenged the American people to put a man on the moon and return him safely within a decade, technologically, we had actually no idea how to pull that off as a nation. But the challenge alone, the setting of a clear goal, unleashed 400,000 engineers to collaborate to put Armstrong on the moon and return him safely to Earth. I remember that summer day in 1969, watching on a fuzzy black and white TV screen as Neil Armstrong took that one step for humankind. So I think America needs to dream again, to awaken that undaunting entrepreneurial spirit that caused us to come to the New World, and to envision progress generation after generation with all our faults and groans and struggles. Jefferson penned that mystical notion of the pursuit of happiness with a capital H, not just a right to a decent life, but a cooperative enterprise we help one another achieve. That I can't truly be happy unless I worry about my neighbor or the homeless or the widow or the orphan. John Kennedy issued a call to service in 2 words: ask not. Martin Luther King Jr. said in his drum major speech, cautioning us against arrogance and a me generation, to be that public servant who leads quietly, saying everyone can be great because everyone can serve. Ronald Reagan said the spirit of volunteer service is flows like a deep and mighty river through the history of our nation. And President Obama said that when you serve today, you connect your own improbable story to American history. The world has sustainable development goals. Why doesn't America identify a set of 10 bold challenges in youth development, education, health, conservation, global independence, and democratic reform that unleashes the energy of the American people like we did with the moonshot? I've seen firsthand the compassion and goodness of the American people. On 9/11, I found myself in the President's Emergency Operations Center below the White House. And 2 days later, the White House operator alerted me that the phones were lighting up like a Christmas tree with offers from around the country to help. As I listened to a phone call of a couple from Seattle driving in their old van across the country to set up a makeshift restaurant for the first responders at Ground Zero in New York, I realized our job was to build on the gathering momentum of millions of acts of kindness and goodness and decency. We need that spirit today. That is who we are, ready to help at every turn. William Languishe, who was there in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the World Trade Center, would write in a book called American Ground, The Unbuilding of the World Trade Center, that a reversal soon occurred by which people began moving toward the disaster rather than away from it. There were so many donations so soon, a trucking operation was set up just to haul the excess of American compassion away. That is the American spirit that defines who we are. Retired General Stanley McChrystal, who served our country for 34 years, likened most citizens' love of country to an old movie line. Is there not one thing in your life that is worth losing everything for? Well, that's how most of us feel about America. Thank you for your service to Connecticut, to our country, for listening to me for so long. And as we think about the Poet Laureate's challenge to us to revision what we will become as a nation and people, I'm confident we will create a stronger sense of we and fulfill the promise of America's creed for people of all backgrounds and circumstances. So thank you for having me. Back to you, Stephen.
John, thank you so much. I know you can't stay with us long, but I just wanted to thank you firstly for your optimism. I think that's something that is really missing in the public discourse. You know, this idea, this notion of the process of becoming, and then your ideas about national service, about civics, and about reimagining leadership in this democracy. So powerful right now for the moment in time in which we have the opportunity to reimagine ourselves and our role in this democracy. And I love, and I have to start our conversation with our esteemed panelists around the idea of honoring what the Constitution has become and is becoming in that process that you described. So John, thank you so much for your wisdom. You have laid out what I think is a blueprint for not only how it is that this commission envisions its role in this government, but also how this government should envision its role in elevating its people and its democracy. So thank you, John. And now we move on to our esteemed panelists. I'd like to welcome each of them. Firstly, we have State Senator Gary Winfield, talk about reimagining our democracy. He has been not only doing it, but putting pen to paper around it for the last few years, and all of that culminating in the last few months of turmoil, growth, change, and necessity. So welcome, Senator Winfield. I also want to welcome Elaine Zimmerman. Elaine is a mentor, a friend, former executive director of the Commission on Children, visionary, and now at the Administration for Children and Families under HHS, really leading the region in helping children and their families succeed. And finally, David Adams of the Urban Assembly. Welcome, David. You are one of my new favorite people who I feel that I have known for a long time, in a lot of ways driving the conversation around civics, around engagement, and around possibility for all of us. So I'd like to have each of you reflect, and I'm going to start with Senator Winfield. Reflect on what Bridgeland opened with, and we can move the conversation from there. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you, and I'm happy to be here with all of the other panelists. I think I'm going to start off short so I can let that process happen. It's happening right now with the comments made by the first speaker. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know exactly what I think as I hear all of that. I want to be a positive voice like Bridgeland is, but as I'm listening to him, I'm also thinking about the moment that we just experienced in this country. And I'm trying to rectify the two things, right? And whether or not what he is suggesting from what I've experienced as a legislator and as a Black person in this country really addresses that moment and how we got there. I think that, and also what we're seeing right now as we lead up to the election, right? So I think in part of his commentary, he talked about civics and the moment that we're in where people are focused on themselves and things like the emoluments clause is being obliterated. But I will say that the president who is doing that work comes from a generation where we had civics as part of what young people would learn as it came through the system. And so I'm just sitting here trying to figure out how do I understand what he's saying. And I think this is part of the issue with moving forward, that I still think that this country has not done the deeper work of dealing with what came before, right? So we talk about Thomas Jefferson and his pen and what he wrote. But Thomas Jefferson to me almost seems like a ghostwriter. He's writing for somebody who he wasn't. And he does a really good job of writing for that character, but he wasn't that person. If Thomas Jefferson believed in happiness with a capital H, then some of the things he would have done and participated in would have been different in his own life. And that's not to be pessimistic, but I do believe that if you want people to buy into the system that we're imagining to come, you have to address those issues that exist for those people. Because one of the reasons why the people I know, the people that surround me in my life, don't believe in systems is because those systems seem to gloss over the issues that they have. And I'm not just talking about the day-to-day issues, but the issues that exist because of the long history that we have here, and just move forward and talk about what we're going to do. And when we get to that new place, wherever we get to, it seems to be very familiar to them because it hasn't changed as much as the people who don't have to worry about that history seem to have understood. And so I guess as we continue the conversation today, I'm going to be focused there. And so I don't want that to come off as pessimistic, because I think that if we don't focus on that to a degree, then all of this stuff, which I think he's got a really good lens to look through, but I think all of it will turn around and become something that we look back and go, well, why didn't that work? And I think it's because some people will have a hard time buying in. And I'll just say finally, just to think about this, a lot of people think about the Peace Corps and the good work that the Peace Corps does, but there are people who look at the Peace Corps and go, it's white saviorism, right? And so if we don't understand the way that different peoples view the things we're talking about, then we're not going to understand the reason why we get to the same space, but see that same space completely differently.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. When I think about reimagining democracy, you wonder, is the democracy being reimagined out from under us? For those of us who perhaps have not been part of the conversation. So thank you for bringing us in that space of the truth part of Truth and Reconciliation. Elaine, welcome.
Thank you. When I was working in Connecticut, I wondered where the family was, because the family was missing in public policy. And I spent a significant amount of time with some others meeting with families all over the state, and intentionally doing so. This connects to what the senator is talking about. So I'm actually connecting these pieces now. I spent a lot of time asking families to come together to share their concerns about their kids and their community and their neighborhoods and safety and education, and really did it in an intentional way so that word was spread across language, it was across race, it was really methodically done, and hundreds of parents came. And people were actually quite racist towards me and said, nobody's going to come, this is ridiculous. It was pretty odd. But the truth was, people came, and they came cross-class, and they came cross-race, and they really wanted to talk, and they had very, very strong views, and they were wonderful, and they were different. But at the end of the day, parents said, this is a great conversation. We're really glad to be here, but we're just parents. I'm just a parent, they kept saying. And what I learned and what they shared with me was that they had learned that parents didn't have a voice in the United States. And the more you actually scrape the surface and you watch government acting as if it's the family, and you watch nonprofits, frankly, acting as if they're the family, and you watch education, particularly when you get out of early childhood and even kindergarten and you go into first grade and up, the family gets pushed out. And the more I touched on this, a few key lessons that connect to what the senator's saying, but with a little ounce of optimism, which is that the family's been kicked out progressively because of race bias. And what you find is, government tends to work with families that are more low income, more vulnerable, more marginal. And government now represents the family. And it is clearly a case of race bias and attitudes also towards poor people. But the ounce of optimism was through this story, which unfolded naturally with families informing the story, was that parents really wanted to learn how to lead. When I said, and I sort of naively said, well, what if we set up some sort of lobby or something? Parents across Connecticut said, we don't want to lobby. We want to learn how to do this. And, we want to do it with you. And so then it was, well, did parents want to learn civic skills? Did they want to learn how change happened? And there were a few really big insights for me. One, every parent wanted to. And where it connects to what Gary's saying is that this work turned into a democracy school for parents that started in Connecticut, but is now across the United States. And as things showed themselves, because none of this is new, it's just showing itself now. As things showed itself, more and more parents, particularly parents of color, wanted to be part of the Parent Leadership Training Institute across the United States because they want to fight the institutional bias. They care so deeply about education along the lines of what David works on. And they want health and safety. So I actually believe, in terms of Mr. Bridgeland's presentation today, his commitment to democracy and his optimism about it, I have that optimism too. I think we just have to really reimagine and make sure that the civic skills are learned and make sure that we tap into the systems where we can affect change. And that's the hard thing, because people get stopped, they get broken, and they get killed. And so working in numbers, and this is where I think a piece of the unexpected strategy is to work across generation. I think the young voice gets listened to, and the elder gets listened to more than most sectors. And I mean young, I mean kindergartners, I mean first graders talking. I think the younger voice is experienced as raw and original, and there's less of people's phobias and biases placed on young children. And the elders have a tutelage that gets respected across diversity. And so I think that one healing space is much more cross-generational work right now, which was why I don't support a national service that would just be for youth. And I do not support something that's just about service. If there's any national service, I want it to have moonshots. And I want who's ever part of it to be entrepreneurial and not just taking care of, but actually having business ideas. And I think that COVID has the opportunity to allow some of this to germinate and to take shape. But I'm not naive to the centuries of and tied against this being diverse. And so I think the challenge is how to create a truly authentic, diverse leadership across generation. And I believe that we can do this now. I think the energy and the anger and the hope are all part of the same flower.
Thank you, Elaine. If you think of civics and our democracy as a franchise, it's clear that it was designed in an exclusive and excluding way. And what's so powerful about the Parent Leadership Training Institute as an example of creating more access to a more diverse group of participants to their democracy through the skill set of understanding the systems that they very well may help bring down or change because they're not working. So I appreciate all of your work in helping create those civic participants. David, your reflections.
Thank you, Steve. So I think we had an opportunity when Bridgeland talked to us to understand what America is becoming. And he quoted the poet laureate and said, when he thinks about America, he says it's on becoming, right? And the question is, how do we become what it is that we want to be? And what is it that we want to be? And so I think Senator Winfield, he raised up a good critique here, and he said that the forces that are devolving our democracy are forces that did go through civic education. They were forces that learned about how a bill becomes a law, for example. And I think I accept that critique, and I would nuance this with the difference between knowing versus doing, and understanding versus experiencing. I think to Lane's point, we need to ensure that young people in our institutions don't just know democracy, but experience democracy. They need to actually practice these things on a daily basis, resolving conflicts, taking in competing perspectives, really understanding how to build community in every daily interaction that they have. When my father and I used to talk, he said one of the things that always was shocking to him, he said he could not understand why Black people in the United States never launched a full-scale revolt. And he and I would talk about this over the kitchen table, and we've come to the belief that the thing that Black people hold in this country was hope. We believed that these institutions would respond to us because those are the words, even if ghostwritten, that were in the Declaration of Independence. Thurgood Marshall believed in that and looked at Brown versus Board of Education. Martin Luther King believed in that when he said that America had cashed us a blank check, right? He said that we are appealing to the ideals of America, even if the reality of America is not to take as what it looks like. So I guess for me, you know, I'm really thinking about this notion of what it takes to experience community. What does it take for young people to be in a place where they don't learn about things through books, through textbooks, through videos, but as actual participants in the things that we want them to be? And I'll leave you with this last piece of reflection from Bridgeland's idea, is that the adults in our spaces need to model these ideals. We need adults in and around our young people to be able to show them what it means to build community. And we need to hold our adults to that standard, right? When we lose hope, we stop holding people to standards. And when we stop holding people to those standards, then they can tell us this is a steak, but really it's just a chuck roast or a burger. And so I'm here today, and I believe that we can continue to say, I want steaks. We were the first, one of the first, I should say, countries in terms of modern democracies to really live out these principles, or at least to start to become those principles, to inspire the rest of the countries around the world. And I think that we can still do that today. And I think that our public education system is going to be the tool that we use to make that happen.
Thank you so much, David. David Adams, Senior Director of Strategy for the Urban Assembly. I do want to remind our viewers that we are so grateful for CTN for broadcasting this live, and for our friends on Facebook Live. Please send in your questions if you have them, as you have them. Gary, I want to come back to you because I want to simmer on this question a little bit, because there is a tension here, Gary. And I think you, in your advocacy for the recent police accountability bill, you really brought that tension to light, which was the tension of how can I begin to look forward when I'm not done looking backward at the injustice, at the intentional sort of historic stain that we all identify and recognize. How do we do that, Gary?
Yeah, well, if I really knew the answer to that, I'd probably write a book. But let me start off by saying I am not married to the terrors of our past, right? That's not what this is. What it is a recognition that it's not behind us. And I think on the floor of the Senate, when we were talking about when we were having this debate, one of the things I said, reflecting on something that James Baldwin talked about, was that time was being consumed, and we weren't going to get that time back. And that even in my life, my time has been consumed. And I have 4 children, 20, 14, and 2 2-year-olds, right? And even the 2 2-year-olds, their time is already being consumed. And so while I want to be extremely optimistic, I recognize the consumption of time, and that's a real thing. And I would even go so far as to be happy if the time wasn't being consumed anymore, as long as my children's time wasn't consumed. And so I think in terms of So how do we understand that that's happening and move forward? I think that we've always done more than one thing at a time. But I think that there need to be people who not just know that there's a problem, but know how to call that problem out in such a way that people recognize it as more than just a group of people who are complaining, no matter how large that group is, no matter what the history is. And that's part of the space that I am trying to occupy right now, to suggest to people that this isn't just grievance. This is necessary repair in order to do that moving forward. And if we don't do that repair, we will do the moving forward, because we've done that throughout our history. Like, that's just what we do. But if we don't do that repair, then the moving forward will be for naught. And I know that sounds pessimistic, but I don't actually see it that way. I see it as realistic. I see it as necessary to do the moving forward. And look, this country has had a desire not to love America, but to love its dream of what America is. And I'm asking this country to love the country that it is. I love my brother for all his faults, right? That's real love. I love my sister for all her faults. I love myself for all my faults. But if I said I love myself and it wasn't me that I was talking about, then that wouldn't be love. And what I'm saying is, when we engage in this what I would call false love of America, then we are doing damage. And it is necessary I want people to actually love the country that exists here, right? And so I think we have to talk about the country that is here. But again, I do think that most of us can hold more than one idea in our head. So as much as I talk about these issues, study these issues, I'm concerned about having a positive outlook, because I've brought children into this world. So I want us to be able to figure it out, but I don't know the answer absent dealing with the things that are at the foundation of this nation.
Thank you, Senator. Know the country that you love. Fix the country that you love. I really love that idea of the truth telling in order to really understand what you're building. Elaine, so much of the work of PLTI, especially in the first set of principles that people who go through PLTI, so much of that work is not only working across difference, but there is healing, there is growth, there's communication. Tell us a little bit about that, because it resonates with what Gary is talking about.
I think about Bridgeland opening up with Joy Harjo, the poet laureate, and Joy says, she has this line I love. She says, "I walk in and out of several worlds each day." And I think that I agree with Gary. I think that one has to go back to the wounds and what they are and what is, and understand the landscape. But I also think one can, just like Joy Harjo says, you can also be moving forward. And in the democracy school, what we did was we would invite parents who wanted to learn how to lead. And parenthetically, I should share that my big aha during that period was not that parents wanted to, or that parents would come across every culture and language and race and economic status to want to lead. And they'd come, with nothing. And there would just have been somebody who was, dead a day, and they would still come to lead because they want to lead. So I know the force is there. I could, and I watched it go across the country. And I'm watching it now across the country. There's thousands who are learning to lead every night, using their screens to learn to lead, who want to be able to do it. But to your point, and to Gary's, in the Parent Leadership Training Institute, we always go back. We talk about the history. We talk about what's happened to people personally, because it's almost as if our bodies are the history of the country, and our own narratives are the history of the country. If we've had certain experiences that, and they share their stories, we share stories, and the stories help people understand the history of the country, because the stories expose who was marginalized, who was treated as if they didn't exist, who was killed, who was harmed, who was made sick. This is a narrative of our country that we ignore. When people bring these stories together, my experience is that there is both an understanding, some anger, but a lot of healing, and also empathy that crosses culture and race, with real understanding that then changes how people work together. One of the things that is interesting to me in the Democracy School for Families is that once they go through this, Stephen, they work across race together, many who never did before. So something happens by going back and going forward. So I think it's necessary. I think it's critical. And it is what we also just know about biological healing and about psychodynamic healing. You've got to do that. But I don't think you sit in the past exclusively. And I think aspiration goes with it, and hopefulness. And the other piece is that this going back and forth is done cross-generation. So children are part of it. They're hearing the stories, but they're also offering the aspiration.
Thank you, Elaine. David, I see you reflecting. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think, I'm always asking myself, what is the ideal? And how does the ideal drive your thoughts, your ambitions, your hopes, right? Who's the greatest basketball player of all time and why, right? Is it Michael Jordan scoring in championships? Is it LeBron James's team building? It depends on what your ideal basketball player is. But once you've understood what your ideal, how do you define it, then you know how to move towards it, right? And I just, when I'm reflecting on this, I want to really ground us in the importance of having an ideal that is worthy, that allows us to keep our heads up, to fill us with hope, and then to give us the energy and the passion to keep moving towards that ideal as we deal with the reality as it is, right? So we've been living in this house, me and my wife, in New Jersey for about 10 years. And my wife has a different ideal of what our home should be, right? And that gives her a lot of passion and energy to tell me what needs to change and what things need to be built outside. And it gives me a little bit of agita, but she has that vision inside. And so as I think about this, right, I think about what it means to hold two ideas in our minds at one time, right? The idea of what is and the idea of what could be. And I think when we come back to the role that the education system needs to play, it needs to play this role in helping kids to really sit down and understand, what do we want our nation to be? What should a community look and feel like? How do we resolve conflicts, right? And if we can't get to there, we're going to get to a place where we are stagnant. We're in this space that we cannot move forward in. And so I guess I'd like to think about how we invest in technical engineering in terms of getting us to the moon, as we invest in social engineering. Our young people who look at today and say, this is not good enough. The way that we're interacting, the way that we're relating, we can do better. That same kind of energy that brings us, new technology and Facebook should be the same energy that people put in every single day to answer the question, how will we live together in communion with each other, and govern ourselves in a way that perfects our union as a democracy, as a people, and as a community.
Gary, as a senator, as a dad, we know what it's like to enter different worlds each day. So I'd love to hear your perspective on some of what you've heard so far.
Yeah, I just want to start off by saying something that every time that I've spoken so far, I keep saying after I speak, I keep saying, I forgot to say that. I think that you've been doing a fabulous job, Stephen. But I do think that Connecticut has lost something for Elaine doing other work. When you and Elaine were working together years ago, I just felt like you two were a really good team. But the work that she's talking about, I think is powerful. So the people that I know who've been through PLTI are some of the fiercest advocates after they've gone through the program that I've ever met, right? And I think it is the notion of being able to recognize what has happened and have a vision going forward, and not just for someone to talk to you about or look at you and say you can be empowered, but to say you already have power, and the job is to get you to first recognize that and then access your power. I think that's important. And why I bring that up is because as David's talking about community, I'm thinking I've seen people in community over the whole course of this uprising. Right, the people in the streets are in community, and there are forces in place that have chosen to try to destroy that, right? But those people know how to do community. They're not just out in the streets yelling and screaming. They're dancing, they're sharing, they're emoting. They're in community. So I think we know how to do this. The problem is whether or not we can sustain it. The problem is whether or not the forces that don't want to see that will prevail. But I think we know how to do it. And I think whatever we decide the way forward is, what we have to recognize is those people in community are asking for something, right? They have a shared vision. They may not all share it exactly the same, but they have a shared vision of an America where, and this is why I think we have to go back to a degree too, because this is not just Black folks. This is white folks and all kinds of people who have a shared vision of an America where the things that they're talking about aren't happening. And that's not going to the moon and doing a moonshot, but that's something that all of those people can buy into. I will tell you that I recognize as an important part of our history the fact that we went to the moon. But for me and many of the people I know, it didn't have all that much meaning. Like it doesn't mean the same thing because of all of the other things going on. And so I think, yes, we have to have something that we share, but I think that thing can be not some amazing technological advance, although it could be. I think that thing could be to begin to make that thing, which is a dream, a reality, right? Because people by the thousands stood in our streets. I mean, I was in West Haven, right? I represent West Haven. People don't come out and protest. We had 3,000 people in West Haven. I went up to the parts of the state where these issues that aren't resident, and you had hundreds of people there. And so even in communities where they don't even talk about these issues, people were sharing. And people were saying, what can I do? How can I be there? Talking to people they never talked to before. So I do think it happens. And I think sometimes we will miss a moment that is important because we will miss that for talking about other things that we could do, when in the moment we are actually operating as community. And I just wanted to put that out there as part of the conversation.
Thank you, Senator. I really love the fact that you described the notion of expanding our notion of what civic engagement is. And Elaine, if you recall, Gary remembers with us the fun time that you and I had to working together. But that notion that you taught us about seeing art as a way to express, art as a way of protest, as a way of telling story, the spoken word as a type of poetry with which we can demand change. So tell us a little bit about that, Elaine, about expanding our notion of civic engagement.
Well, first, I just want to respond to something that Gary said, Stephen, if it's okay, which is that, I think what Gary's saying is that the reimagining democracy is happening now, and it's happening in the communities. And so how do we build on that, right? And I think that there's a way that there is some magic in both art and in cross-generation work that just has something very special to it. When 9/11 happened, we can all remember, I trust, where we were when the towers came down and who told us and what we did. And I remember thinking that my world had just changed in terms of what it meant in terms of our country and safety, and that I needed to figure out what children thought about this. And was the World Trade Center, were the towers coming down something that children would care about only in Manhattan, or maybe in the towns in Connecticut that were near New York City? Or would children care about terrorism as it was understood then in that particular moment across Connecticut? And what we did was we had children draw and tell stories and dance and sing. They could do any art medium they wanted, but they talked about 9/11. And then we brought them all to the Capitol. And it wasn't easy. A lot of people didn't want to know what children thought, or they thought children didn't think anything, or don't let children think about this, or, you know, you shouldn't have a second grader talk about this. They shouldn't think about it. But it was really stunning and extraordinary what happened with children coming with their little pieces of art that were sacred to them, that it was almost like a seashell, each thing that the child brought, where they were actually asked, construct something that tells us what you think about this or you feel about this. And you know, we made it safe, etc. That's another conversation. But at the end of the day, it was extraordinary. And the children heard each other's experiences, and that became some sort of harmony, hearing children from all over the state presenting their art. So they didn't just stand up and say what they thought. They presented their song, their poem, their dance, but it was all so deeply felt. And there was some way that art goes straight to the heart. So you could take it in more rapidly. That was extraordinary. And then what happened from that was that we did the same thing when Katrina happened. So the World Trade Center, you know, the towers go down, that was New York. So it's near enough to Connecticut. But here we are now in New Orleans, but it's now we're going from unnatural disaster to natural disaster, but full of racism. And so we did the same thing. What did the children think about Katrina? And would they share their art? And we brought them all to the state capitol. And once again, a lot of people didn't want us to ask them and they didn't want to discuss it, but we did it. And the same exact thing happened. But now the children were combining actually 9/11 and Katrina. And I'm talking second graders, first graders, sixth graders, high school. And they were saying, well, when the towers went down, I thought, well, our country, we're going to do something to make it safe because we've learned it's not as safe as we thought. And I'm trusting people. And then the children of color said, now I realize that I'm not safe in my own country. And these incidents were put together, but it was art that allowed them to talk. And it was art that allowed them to tell the truth and to also say the truth in front of children who were different from them. So I learned that art, one, got straight to the heart. It brought people together. It allowed for different views. Whereas if I just say my different view, maybe Stephen, you'll walk out on me. But if we come and we each bring our art, something else happens. So I saw art as a way to expand the congregation. It allowed for more diversity. It worked across age. And then there were pieces that just got so to the heart that they made it to major newspapers and they made it all over the news. So I also saw that children as messenger, coupled with art, working cross race and culture on a critical issue, actually had some important messaging. And it also took things deeper. And then we did the same thing with Newtown. And watching in the state of Connecticut, children respond to 9/11, Katrina, and Newtown became a conversation at 3 points: on bias, on hatred, on who gets taken care of when, on geography, and on global affairs. And so, and more recently, and Stephen was part of this, I held a poetry reading that was for all of New England, but actually went national, on using art against hatred. And what was interesting was it was people from New England, but it's already gone viral. And now what's happening is people are asking, can we do this? Can we do this? So there's something about art that makes it a slightly bit, it goes deeper, faster, and maybe it's also safer.
That's beautiful, Elaine. You know, David, I know I admitted to you, but I don't know that I had admitted to everyone else on this panel that part of the inspiration for this conversation was Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton. And just the notion that we could take the founding, which as flawed as it was, and repurpose the founding through the lens of, or at least the optics of diversity, the optics of seeing ourselves in that founding, not in a way that forgave the founding in any way, but in a way that allowed us, at least for a moment, to see ourselves in it. And from there, take the good, reimagine the bad, but never forget the ugly. And what was really powerful, at least for so many people, was, or at least for me, was the response of so many people wanting to consume Hamilton. But don't we run a risk, David, in doing that, in reimagining democracy in such a way to where we run the risk of forgetting, the original trauma, forgetting the lasting impact? How do we maintain that memory while healing, while building something better?
Yeah, it's a very important question, Stephen. And civilizations, I think, are always in the process of reconstructing narratives to reflect who they are and who they want to be. So I think when Senator Winfield talks about this notion of holding two things at the same time, I think he may overstate the easiness of that, because I think that is one of the hardest things for most people to do. Either we are good or we are bad. Either we are oppressive or we are not, right? Either we are a country of freedom or we are a country of slavery. And in fact, we are both. And as we look at these reimaginings of who we are, and these retellings of who we are, and these narratives that are created from these retellings, we're able to stay flexible in this notion of building community, right? And I think Senator Winfield is correct when he says that we know how to do this. I'm skeptical a little bit that everybody wants to do this, right? I don't actually think that at the end of the day, many Americans want to be in community with each other in the way that would be honest and fair and provide justice and live up to the ideals that we put forth. And I think most people feel uncomfortable with that idea, right? It's not my words. It was Thomas Jefferson's words. It's not my Constitution, it's the American Constitution. And what we are asking for is to live up to those words and be in community, and be fair to those who want to be part of that social fabric. So I guess the dangers are twofold. The first danger is that we seep ourselves in our wounds so deeply that we don't try to heal them, right? And then the second danger is that we don't address our wounds at all, and then that they become septic and they just take over our body and destroy it. And it takes deep leadership to move forward in this space, right? The easy thing to do is rile people up. The easy thing to do is create anger. The easy thing to do is to not construct, but destruct. And that's where we need to look into our young people whose construction we will leave this to, right? We need to keep thinking, what country will we be leaving to our youth? What systems will we construct so that our youth can get better than we are? And that when we are thinking about our nation and what it means to develop and to create community, we need to be able to understand that these narratives are the thing that binds us together. It is the narrative of who we are as a nation, as an experiment, as an idea that connects Americans to each other. It's not our geography, right? People, when de Tocqueville came to the United States in the 1800s, he said that there are people bonded by ideals. We are people bonded by concepts. As a civil affairs officer in the Army, sometimes we look to understand how governance drives conflict, or lack of governance drives conflict. And one of the things we look is, what are the connections between groups? Are they transactional? Or are they value-based, right? And it's much harder to destroy a value-based relationship bond than it is to destroy a transactional bond. You can just replace a transaction with something else, but you can't replace values with something else. So at the end of the day, right, the danger lies in looking at our wounds and then wrapping ourselves in them, right? Not being able to see the future, not being able to inspire, not being able to tell our young people we can do better, these institutions can improve, our community can be stronger. But as Senator Winfield says, in America, we have not had the courage or the willingness to be in community with our own history, to be in relationship with our own truth. It makes us feel bad, or certain of us. And we just need to come to understanding that we need to live with two things at once, that we are a nation that inspired others and ourselves to look beyond the barbarity of slavery, that people fought to, when they looked at that situation, to get rid of that. And there are other people said, I want to continue that. But people gave their lives because they had moral clarity and they bled to make progress. And that is the progress that we have to inherit, right? The progress of people who are in their graves based on an ideal, based on a vision. That is what we bequeath to our children. And that is why these ideals are important.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is dead on. I wanted to speak briefly to the concept of being able to believe in the improvement of institutions. Part of the reason that I can believe in the improvement of institutions is because I understand the history, right? And I think that some of the problem we have is not, if we're going to relate it back to the beginning and civics and what we learn, is that we just don't learn the history here, right? And so I can't see the improvement if I believe that we were always perfect, right? And this is about forgetting versus not knowing, right? So we believe that, some people came here, they were looking for religious freedoms, we have pilgrims, right? But we don't even think about why Virginia is what it is. We don't think about the Virginia Company. We don't think about how money was involved as much or more than that story that we tell. And so we just don't understand the history of this nation. David spoke briefly about the problem with holding the two ideas in the head. But I think many of the people who've historically been oppressed do a better job of holding those two ideas because they haven't had the luxury of holding on to only the dream, the vision, and being of privilege, right? Ralph Ellison wrote about that in his most famous work. That when you are able to do that and you bump into those who are invisible to you, you're fighting with the ghost in the dark, but they're right there for you to see. You just can't see them. And so I do think that we need to understand what it is we are so that we can actually understand how far we've come. And at the same time, if you understand who you've always been, you will recognize that while I've come this far, I haven't come far enough. And it's okay that I haven't come far enough, right? But it's only when you have the privilege to not see that it has to be, we either are a slave nation or not. We're both of those things. We either are this or that, because your identity becomes tied into that what I would call lack of vision, but your vision of what America is. And so we have to do some work, which is the revisioning, if you will, of what America is. But it's not really revisioning. It's first sight now. Right? We're finally coming to a point where we actually look at what we are and say, wow, we came a long way from there. And we have a long way to go. And I can understand why people are looking at this now, and back to my point earlier, and say, wow, I don't have a lot of time. I get it now. I understand it. And so I actually feel as though, even though I have all the time in the world, I feel as though, well, maybe I don't, because I don't have the time to live in a world where you have as much time as I have. You have as much ability to look out and not have to worry about whether you actually see what's going on as I do. And I as a human being don't think that's appropriate. I as a human being don't think that's okay. And so I'm joining in that work. I'm joining in this community with you to make it better.
Gary, I want to simmer on this just a little bit more with you, because there are parents with small children watching. And that tension that you described, I want you to describe from your point of view as a dad of two tiny ones. How do you balance that deep understanding that you have of our history with this idea, as posed by one of our viewers, of helping your children visualizing and imagining the life that they want and the world that they want to live in and create together? How do you balance those two for your kids?
I think one arms you to do the other, right? So I think an understanding of what actually surrounds you arms you to go out and do all of the amazing things that you want to do. I have 4 children, so I get to do this multiple times. And with all of my children, I make sure that they are clear-headed about the America that we live in. You live in my house, there's no mistaking the America that we live in. And yet I tell them with that, there have always been possibilities. People are talking about what we can do now. We've always been able to do things. Madam C.J. Walker didn't just enter this world, right? She's been gone for a long time. And so part of my job as a parent who recognizes that is to talk to them about the amazing possibilities and what opportunity is. I changed the frame for my kids about opportunity. I'm of the school that opportunity is what you get to do that you don't have to do, right? And so everything that you get to do that you don't have to do is an opportunity, including the next breath, right? And when you imbue them with a sense of what opportunity is from that frame, they look at everything as an opportunity despite the problems. And so my children, I hope, take those lessons and walk into the world and see opportunity everywhere, right? There's an opportunity to do this thing, there's an opportunity to do that thing, but it doesn't have to be big. And so they approach the world in a different way. I came into the General Assembly looking at all kinds of opportunities because people hadn't done things, right? And picked up those things. And we were able to do things that people said weren't possible simply because of that perspective. And that's why I started off saying, I don't really want to be the negative person because that's not who I am, right? I'm very much about, oh yeah, we can get that done. But the reason that I can get it done is the marrying of the two, the recognition that whatever it is I get to do, no matter how small, that I don't have to do is an opportunity. And the drive comes from understanding the history that we have. And that is my motivation for doing those things. So as my children progress, that is what I'm trying to give them as well.
Thank you, Senator. Elaine, you mentioned in your discussion about multi-generational impact. You also said something interesting which resonated with what Bridgeland said and something that I know very much about the way you do business, which is entrepreneurship and the imperative of the skill set of entrepreneurship in those unlikely places like the work of public policy. So tell us a little bit more about entrepreneurship and how being entrepreneurial in public policy is part of this formula.
I think that this idea of a national service, is so interesting, but I really deeply believe that service without creativity and service without an entrepreneurial piece is only one window open. It's a critical window, so I actually honor it. I think it's great, but I think that there is a way that particularly young people and people who have been left out, they have ideas that are brand new. And they also have a way to take something unexpected and put it with something old that combusts and makes it magical and a totally different thing. And so I think helping young people in particular, teenagers, middle school, and I mean, I even think little kids, but I just think that there's a way of building ideas that have to do with building new business and growing things and thinking about things differently is so important. And it's a way, it ignites a hopefulness also. And I think we I was listening to, I just think that there's so many ways we leave out people, and so we're missing enterprise that could help our democracy. I think that we incentivize only for some cohorts and not others. I think we help people think about growth and business, but only for some groups. I think we leave youth out of it so often. I'm sure David Adams is not doing that, but I think that across the board, youth are treated as if they're problems, or they might get in trouble, or you better lock your car, and not that these kids have fabulous ideas if they're just helped to be leaders. And then I think that fits with policy, so that policy, the etymology of the word policy is floor. It's what we stand on. It's what keeps us, grounded. And I believe that we have to understand public policy to change to move our democracy forward, but that it becomes a sort of little special little secret that's in only some people's pockets. And when people learn what public policy is, and I believe children, I believe youth can learn what public policy is, it can just be done in a way that is age appropriate, that then you get to, well, what is the question we're actually really talking about? What is it we're really trying to change here? What are we trying to improve? And that helps have a focus and a clarity, and understand that when you have a policy and an idea that you can actually improve upon it, you can add to it. The way we know in a legislature, you can amend a bill, you can add a technical amendment, you can always be improving something year after year after year. I think that we don't teach that in a way that could actually help in neighborhood, in community, in family, and in law. And I try to do that, you know, plenty of times I fail, but I try to do it in everything I do, because I believe that public policy is a foothold to democracy. People have been left out of it. People don't understand it, and that it needs to be cross-generational, and that there's an entrepreneurial component to it, that look at technology and the ideas that came forward, and that cohort. And I just think that we are missing whole voices because we don't think certain cohorts have growth capacity, and we also think the ideas aren't going to be good enough, and we are so wrong. So opening the windows could really change our democracy.
Thank you. I love that.
Not just an idea, you know.
I love what you described democracy like an action verb, and that the iterative process that actually is our democracy. David, you know, I want you to on yourself a bit, and in the work of the Urban Assembly, describe in the work that you do how you imbue that notion of the iterative process that is our democracy.
So I want to give you a story. I walked into a third grade classroom in New York City one time and I asked the kids, all right, raise your hand if you ever had to solve a problem in school. And so, you know, a couple of kids, they raised their hand, and I asked a young lady and said, oh, you know, tell me what problem you have had to solve. And she said, you know, like a math problem. I'm like, all right, okay, so that's a good example. So we got a math problem. Does anybody have an example of a problem that your school has taught you to solve that doesn't have to do with math? Bang, all the hands went down, right? It turns out that our schools have oriented ourselves to producing engineers, right, who can solve problems of data and of technological challenge. But we have abdicated our responsibility to producing young people who can solve the problems of being in community with each other. Mm-hmm. And so at the Urban Assembly, we believe, and we have invested in this notion that we would like our young people to leave our schools being able to solve problems, social problems, mathematical problems, problems of community, problems of technology, that in order to bring energy into our nation, our young people have to be equipped with the skills, attitudes, and values to look at a thing and say, we can do better than this, right? And I look around and I look at the innovations our country has produced, and that is one area where I am a little bit disappointed, right? Yes, I can get something delivered to my house in 2 days. Yes, I can connect to my relatives in Haiti, you know, at the touch of a button and using Facebook. But where is the energy for bringing that same kind of problem-solving intuitiveness, that initiative, that entrepreneurial spirit to our actual communities? Right? To Elaine's point, our young people, they can solve these situations if they're given an end state that they need to move into. And our end state that we need to achieve is people living together with fairness and inclusion. And this takes choices. This takes trade-offs. This takes perspective taking, right? This takes the type of education that allows our young people to go into the world and understand the choices they need to make, balance off the opinions of other people, and do what we talked about before, be statesmen and stateswomen, right? You and I talked about this, Stephen, the difference between the notion of a politician and the notion of a statesman, where the notion of a statesman is an elevated, esteemed person who is taking in many different perspectives and pursuing the common good, right? nobody looks down on a statesman. Nobody's like, oh, that guy's just a statesman. That's a compliment, right? And so these ideas that we've just completely lost. What is the common good? How do we pursue it? They're like vestigial organs. People have a sense that we used to have some sort of value that wasn't market driven. It wasn't a question of how much money this was going to make me. It was a question of how is this helping us be in community? How can we pursue a common sense of who we are together? And instead, we've traded that off, and we've traded it off for it's math and science. Very important. I care deeply about math and science. Math and science is not going to save this country. When JFK stood up and asked people to take a moonshot, we already had the math and science we need. We didn't have the motivation. What he provided was a vision, right? To take the math and science skills that we had and put somebody on the moon with them. I'm asking for us to do the same thing when we talk about reimagining democracy with our schools, with our communities. What is the vision of our nation, right? Who is the JFK who will stand up and say that we are going to take a moonshot, as Bridge was saying, and take hundreds of thousands of thoughts and put them together and say, we can do better than this. You know, Senator Winfield, as you talked about, Stephen, he spearheaded a bill that improved the quality of policing in Connecticut, right? And those are the kinds of conversations that we need to be having, not because we don't like police, but because the state of policing is not as good as it should be. There's rarely a thing in our institutions today that we can't look at and say, we could do better. You know, when I run 2 miles for the military and I'm looking at my time, I'm like, I could do better. Right. And that's the energy that's going to take for us to combat that cynicism, because people are going to beat us, and not in pushing us down, but by delivering us cynicism. They're going to deliver us a steady diet of you can't do anything. Elaine said this. I am already empowered. I am the citizen. We are the people, and we self-govern. Right. So we can do this work if we believe, and we have that one space, that ideal that says that everything that we do is about the common good. And when those things are not being met, we got to look at ourselves in the mirror and say we can do better, not because we're terrible people, not because we all need to jump off a bridge and wallow in a sea of self-pity, but because people did better for us. And that's why we're here. Some people believed in me. And that's what I got to do for my kids. And that's why education needs to incorporate these ideas so that our young people feel the energy in order to move us towards that outcome.
David, that's really powerful. You know, this notion of, one of the, I think the greatest disservices and the greatest bill of goods that this system tends to perpetuate in our people is that we see our government as something that is outside of us, just beyond us, unreachable. But if there's anything I think that we can express today is that the governed are the government. We are this nation. And if we don't see ourselves there, then we need to take the seat. And Gary, you've run a couple miles these last few months. And, when I think about the sense of urgency with which you ran those couple miles, tell us what's next. What's next to you? I know that you're not going to rest on these laurels. So what's next in your sense of urgency?
Well, I think the thing that's most urgent to me is not a piece of policy. It's work that's been going on for a while. So one of the things that's important to me, and talking about possibilities, right? What's important to me is that people who haven't always seen themselves as being able to do exactly what you just said, Stephen, take the seat, recognize that they can do that. And so my story doesn't start off as somebody who's going to take any seat. My story starts off going somewhere completely different. I grew up in a housing project in the Bronx with no vision that I would ever sit in any elected seat. And even when my life turned around and became a pretty good life, I still didn't think of that because of the history that I had. But the fact that I've been able to, as a person who comes from where I come from, do what I'm currently doing and actually have impact, not just in the state, but in the nation, has said to me that I have a mission, which is to get others who come from spaces that generally aren't even thinking about politics, forget taking a seat, to understand that they have a space here. And that space is not just for advocacy, which is great, but that space sometimes is to be the person in the seat, to be the person who's sitting in seats that you would never think of, like governor. And so I've spent a lot of time recently in the last couple of years directly talking to people who are yelling at government, to be honest with you, because that's where I was found when I came to realize I was running for office. And saying to them, that's great, but power doesn't care that you're yelling at it, right? We have this notion that you should speak truth to power, and that's cool, right? But I actually want you to keep speaking truth, right? Because while you're speaking truth, I'm doing what I'm doing. What I've said to people is, Malcolm X talked about speaking to people in a language they could understand. What power understands is power. So you need to get yourself some power so that you can speak that power back to people who have power, because then they have no choice but to listen. And so the most important work I'm going to be doing, I think, for the rest of my career, is getting young people who are not a natural fit, if you will, to understand that that is what they should be doing. I'll be doing stuff on police and the criminal justice system and all of that stuff, which, great, we get accolades for it. But the most important stuff that I'm going to be doing is talking to young people and getting them to understand. And we have some young people, by the way, in the state who've entered politics who, they're early in their careers, but they're like, I can't believe I'm doing this at this point. But they're all of those young people, by the way, are phenomenal at it because they come from a different place with a different perspective. If I just have one more second. I was born in 1974 in the Bronx, right? So you can kind of get an understanding of what my history might include. And the music I listen to is, and I think I may have said this to you before, Stephen, it's hip hop, right? And it's different than the music my parents were listening to, my grandparents were listening to. When a song came on in their generation, would come on and have its life and it died, right? That's what it was. And you might remember it later, right? But it was not a radio thing anymore. During my time, song would come on, it might die, but then somebody might bring a new track to it, right? Or somebody might come and say something new on it, right? They remix this thing. And then when people got phones, they would get a new phone constantly. All of these different things. We would just keep doing things in a different way. And I think that's what these younger people bring into politics that older people don't recognize, but that is powerful. They don't settle for what is, right? Because you can remix your life. You can remix policy. And I think that's important because they are the ones who come in and change the way things are working. Because when it doesn't work, they just say, maybe I should ask a different question. Maybe I should approach this in a different way. It's not okay for it just to go away and be gone forever. So.
Thank you, Senator. Elaine, when I think about the Children's Leadership Training Institute, the first little face with soulful purpose that comes to mind is Miriam. You know Miriam. She has written a series of books together with her friends called Soulful Sydney. And what's interesting about that book is that it talks about difference. It talks about being yourself and being proud of who you are. It talks about the importance of speaking your truth, but also hearing others' truths. And what I love about that is that she is a child leader. And so much of what Gary is describing in that energy, that ability to mix the tape and reimagine from what we have to what we could be is imbued into children's leadership. Tell us a little bit about that and your motivation for expanding the curriculum into the children's space.
Sure. I was in New Haven at a graduation at Town Hall of the Democracy School of Parents, and the children were there, and it just seemed like, uh-oh, we're making a real mistake here because the children were watching the parents graduate, and they were just so interested in leadership. And so the question was, well, could we create a leadership school for children? And how old would children need to be to start being involved in leadership? And could we design it so that it happened at the same time? Because the children, this was a real aha, but parents would come to learn how to lead because they wanted to affect change. And they would bring their children and we would provide dinner. And children came, and we would have a class of 25, but we would have 80 children. And so the question was, how do we give leadership skills to children? And so we began a leadership school where the children learned the same things that parents did, but using children's literature. And it starts at 4 years old. And the children are so excited about becoming leaders, and they do a project together and they talk about leadership, and they have all ended up influencing their classrooms, changing how they are at home. They are so proud that their parent is a leader and that they're a leader, and it inherently teaches them, to David's point, they learn how to problem solve together, and they are learning to problem solve in this particular situation across difference, all kinds of differences, because the classes are made up of people from different cultures and different races and different languages, and so are the children. And they plan one thing that they're going to solve together, and they do that project, but they also learn from each other, and the impact is pretty stunning. And you met one such child. I've watched this occur on reservations. I've watched it in one language, in many languages. In Alexandria, Virginia, I go every year just to watch the children graduate from the Children's Leadership Training Institute, because it's so extraordinary. And there, you have a little 4-year-old and saying, hi, my name is Myrtle. I'm a child leader. And she says, so then she's asked, well, what is her leadership? And she says, well, I stopped my brother from bullying, and talks all about kindness. And this is her leadership. And each child has their own notion of what leadership is. It's just so beautiful. So, I've come to really learn that there's leadership in every human being. And the earlier we talk about it in the context of community, the more it's almost unimaginable what can come from this. I think this conversation is really about ghosts and remix. That's what I would relabel the title of this conversation, because I think it's about bringing the past in and then bringing the young in with this understanding, per Gary's point of, the young know now how to cut and paste everything to go to what's possible.
Thank you, Elaine. Ghosts and remix. I love that. As we come upon the hour, I want to pose a final question to you. One thing that I learned from a mentor was that in order to really to shake up the room when you're promoting change in public policy, is that you have to invite an unexpected guest, somebody that you wouldn't expect to be at the table, perhaps somebody that's missing, perhaps somebody that really helps reframe ideas in a way that you wouldn't even have imagined in the circle of trust that to trust. So David, I want to start with you. If you had this table and you were imagining bringing change, who would you bring with you? What is that unlikely guest that you would introduce into the conversation to mix the tape, as Elaine said and Gary said?
So I think when we think about who's at the table and why, Senator Winfield talked about power and who has power and how do you attain power and use it to influence outcomes. I really believe that the most important people at the table need to be youth who have the ability to really contribute to the conversation, right? I've seen people put young people up there and, they're just like figureheads and they don't actually think about things. But when folks come together and they link, let me take a step back. In the military, one of the things that is interesting is like you join a unit, right? And the unit that you're in a part of is almost always some unit from World War II or something from Vietnam, because that's when the Army was from the largest. And at whatever you're doing at the worst part of your time, I'm always thinking to myself, the unit lineage is that they stormed the beaches of Normandy or they did this thing, right? I got to do at least as good as that. This can't be as bad as what people have done before me. And so when we link these ideas of like, what am I doing? What am I feeling? And when youth come to the table and say, look, I need to be able to take this over when you're done, you need to have a sense that we're not infinite, right? We're not going to be here forever. It's amazing to me that an enslaved person 200 years ago could maintain a sense that I could be sitting and having a conversation with you today, right? And I know they maintained that sense because they produced culture that protected, their sense of worth. They produced music and song. And so when we connect our young people to our current kind of leadership, I think it produces this idea that I'm not infinite. I'm not going to make it out of this life. Nobody does. But the best that I can do is leave you with something to inspire you to work towards. So I guess to answer your question here, having youth at the table in a way that gives them that sense that this is your country too, this is your community, this is your unit. And people are going to look to you and the decisions that you make, even in the United States. I mean, I know this is crazy to say, right? At some point, we're not going to look at this country in the same way. Rome didn't last forever, and we probably won't either, but it will be not because we didn't try. It will be because we stopped caring about who we are and stopped trying to get better. And when our youth look to the people who are leading now and say, hey, look, I want to be able to take a decent thing that you gave me. Don't blow this up for me. I want an actual something to work on. I think it leaves us with this idea that we have to at least live up to those who came before us. And also we need to honor those who will come after us with the kinds of systems and structures and ideals that inspire us to greatness.
Thank you for that, David. Elaine, who would be your unlikely guest?
Well, your question reminds me of that New York Times section in the book review where they ask an author, well, who would you have to dinner? And you get to bring people from different generations. I think my guest would be youth, to David's point, and also to Gary's. I'd have it be youth, but I'd have my guest would be a ghost. I think that there's really something about the past and the messages from the past coupled with youth that is almost magical if it's done in a way that isn't frightening. It's not Halloween. It's about something that is about ancestry and narrative that is rich, almost biblical, that does something that has a tutelage to it, that is coupled with the unexpected skill set that Gary's talking about, that kids have, and that new ways of doing it and new expectations. And well, if it's not this, then fix it. The combination, I think so much could happen. And I know you can't literally bring a ghost to a dinner party, but this question of it's almost like, what would happen if we skipped a generation in some of these conversations and you had the young people and the elders? I think there's power in that. I wouldn't leave out the middle generation forever, but I think there's some wisdom in having conversations that are the elderly and youth and not the generation in between.
Thank you, Elaine. Senator.
Well, I'm not going to break the streak, but I'll just say this. You asked about the unexpected guest, and it reminds me of something else. So I used to listen to a radio show, Unwelcome Guest, and the radio show was about conversations about wealth and power and resistance to a corporatized world. And as I think about that, the reason why I will be bringing the youth to the table is because I think they would have a resistance to some of the things that are already in place that don't work for everyone. And their voice would be unique. And I'll just tell you a brief story to kind of say how powerful they can be. So when I ran for office the first time, and I run campaigns, I knew everything you're supposed to do, but I did everything completely wrong, if you will. It turned out it was completely right. One of the things I did was I said, how do I get the young people in the community to buy in and believe that this is real? And I know that in politics, even though I was in my 30s, people were like, you're too young. And David talked about the military. When I was in the military, I remember seeing these guys and thinking, wow, they're older. And they weren't older, right? Like the guys leading were young people, right? And so I was like, how do I get them to buy in? And I said, what I always wanted to happen when I was involved in these conversations? I wanted to actually be able to speak and be heard. And so even though I would never advise anybody to do this, I kicked all the adults out of my campaign. And my campaign was completely run by young people. And what happened was they had ideas that I would never have. They did things in ways that I would never do it. And I wasn't the candidate that was endorsed, right? But they beat the endorsed candidate here in New Haven when New Haven still had a machine, right? Like that just
That's
didn't
great.
happen.
That's a
And
great
it
story.
happened because they weren't brought to the kiddie table, so we said we had them, but they were brought to the big boy table. They were allowed to make decisions, and we as adults followed their decisions. And so I would bring them because I think it's important to have their voice, but it's not just important. I think it's imperative because they can do and think in ways that we no longer
Yeah,
have the ability to do.
that's great.
Thank you so much. You know, there's something that's going to resonate with me from this conversation, in addition to mixtape, and in addition to Ghost, and it's really that spirit that you described, David. There's something really powerful in imagining, could they have possibly known people that were enslaved, people that were denied their participation in this franchise that is our democracy? Could they have possibly known? Could they imagine that we would be having this conversation today? And I love, David, that notion that they did, and that is evidenced by their music, by culture, by all of the things that have been passed down generation to generation that make it possible for all of us not only to be having this conversation, but to be doing so with a sense of urgency, a sense of purpose, and a sense of honoring the spirits that each of us carry with us that are timeless. So for that, I want to thank you. And in honor of those spirits, thank you for your service. Thank you for your determination. And most of all, thank you for making this the better democracy that it is becoming. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our viewers. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.